Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Sally Eaves, Global Cyber Trust at GF Cyber. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's LinkedIn Live special roundtable event, the future of IoT, eSIM, private 5G, security, and beyond too. I'm your moderator for today, and before I ask our stellar panel to kind of introduce themselves, their role, and where they've come from, I just want to set the stage a little bit about our event today. Firstly, over to you, our audience, just to say we really do welcome your feedback and your interaction. So all questions are welcome. We'll have a dedicated Q&A at the end. And if we can as well, we might bring a few in during the main session too, if they fit really well. And secondly, I just want to highlight really our why for being here today. So we have our age of convergence, as I like to call it. And we're working and living and learning in a time where IoT really is the catalyst, the hub of innovation, if you will. And we have this explosion of connected devices across the world that's really transforming industries. So we're exploring this from a diversity of perspectives and in 4 key phases. Firstly, IoT, the transformation catalyst. Second, the IoT challenge. Thirdly, IoT enablement from a tech perspective. And then IoT enablement from a people, culture, and skills perspective. Excuse my voice, recovering from an illness here. So before I go any further and set the stage for the first question, let's go to the panel. Vincent, can you give a brief introduction to your role?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel here today. My name is Vincent Vermeulen. I'm part of the Channel and Alliance team here at Armis. What we do is we help customers and partners discover, give visibility and security into managed, unmanaged IoT devices.
Fantastic. And Nick, if I can ask you to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everyone. My name's Nick Earle. I'm the CEO of SI. We are a global MVNO. Got over 2,000 customers and offices in 7 countries around the world. I'm speaking to you from the UK, but we also have a significant presence in the US.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And over to you, Stefan.
Thanks, Sally. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. So my name's Stefan Storrell. I'm the research lead here at Collider Intelligence. We're an independent research house covering the roaming and connectivity space. So my role is focused primarily on IoT, so connectivity, eSIM, private networks, things like that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. And next, if I could over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's Mark Thurman. I'm speaking to you from lovely Boston, Massachusetts. I work for IBM, where I look after connected edge strategy in the IBM Consulting Group.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. The best view in the house, I think, as well, from our preview earlier on. And last but certainly not least, I'd love to welcome you, John.
Hi, I'm John Griebling, and I am with Itron. We're a large global supplier of industrial IoT devices and network solutions and software solutions to deliver outcomes to our customers and rely heavily on a number of different communication technologies. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, and my role at Itron is to drive the adoption of 3GPP technology into more and more of our product portfolio.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and thank you all. So I think maybe if we go to our first pillar, so IoT is this transformation catalyst. Let's explore maybe the drivers of this change, the explosion I was talking about in the introduction of IoT and technology convergence, and what is behind this. And perhaps, Nick, could I go to you first just to set the stage about these drivers of change?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to start off from the business angle, Sally, and I'm sure we'll descend into the technology. You've got some pretty some smart speakers on this event. I mean, at the end of the day, this is about a business process optimization. I mean, we'll talk a lot about connectivity and devices and firmware, but the real opportunity for IoT is to turn a product, in my view, turn a product into an experience. And what I mean by that is that information about how a product is being used is more valuable than the product itself. And that means that if you can actually capture the data about how customers are using your product, you actually get the sort of long tail of personalization. I mean, if you've got 100,000 people buying your products, you don't really know how they're using them, what features they're using. But with IoT, if you can capture that data, you can actually find out exactly which features, which people are using, how often they're using them, which gives you opportunities to personalize the offer that you are giving back to them. And it also gives you then an opportunity to leapfrog perhaps some more established brands who are saying, well, buy us because we're the well-known brand. But now you're the disruptor. You have the better experience. And maybe you also have the lower cost, because what IoT also does is it disintermediates people in the supply chain who perhaps are only adding value because they're moving your product down the line. So if you get the holy grail of a lower cost product with a better experience, you have a fantastic competitive advantage. And to me, that's the promise of IoT.
I love that, Nick. Excellent point. And Vincent, maybe I could go to you on this one as well. I know particular alignment when we were speaking earlier.
Certainly. So, as following obviously the business drivers is what are the devices that are enabling those changes? And obviously what we've seen much of is the reduction in cost of those devices, a reduction in energy usage, and really a great increase in the amount of power, compute power, even software, what kind of applications, what kind of data it can ingest. And obviously there's some challenges that we'll be discussing later that comes with that. But just the understanding of the devices, the types of devices, and the availability and connectivity of those devices having exploded in response to the business drivers.
Fantastic, excellent point. And I just had a message in here via Twitter actually at the moment as well, saying also interested around IT and OT convergence as well. So this theme of integration in so many different ways really resonating with people as well. Did anybody else on the panel want to come in about these drivers of change for IoT at the moment?
I'll jump in very quickly, and I'll perhaps try and pick up the Twitter reference on IT-OT convergence, which is something we see quite a lot of. And there was a recent report that I just looked at earlier today, talking about how there's more spending on the IT side than the OT hardware. So there's quite a lot of action. I know IBM are very active in the industrial IoT space. But just to go back to and pick up a little bit on what both Vincent and Nick were saying, there's this absolute ubiquity of cellular connectivity at this point. We've now gone up to the next G, so we're now on 5G. But we've been connecting things for a number of years on a number of networks. But now, with the just explosion of capability globally for higher speed cellular networks and all of the variants, that's given opportunity to create new service offerings. Or to use what Nick was saying, new experiences.
Fantastic point, Mark. Thank you. That's excellent. I think what I'll do now is I'll go on to a kind of related question to this as well, maybe going a little bit more industry specific. So IoT is really transforming different verticals at the moment. And we've touched on a few very naturally already, but kind of in the round, things like manufacturing, smart buildings, but also things around IoT human system connection as well, and Industry 5. John, could I go to you first on this one and talk a little bit more about the work you're doing at Itron around devices, for example, maybe picking out electric, gas and water meter industries, for example?
No, sure. So Itron's basic business need is to provide secure and intelligent IoT connectivity for our devices, for our customers. And we've been doing that for decades, on some cases on cellular networks, and in other cases on our Itron mesh technology, if you're familiar with that. We're seeing a very strong shift in the marketplace for cellular connectivity over the next decade, and again, that's what I focus on, is adapting our product portfolio to accommodate that. And in order to do that, we've really settled on an approach where our mission is to provide the connectivity the customer wants, whatever that is. Okay. And so without, the days of us having to say, hey, we don't support that connectivity, those days are over. So we have an architecture for the products that give us the flexibility to adapt to whatever the customer needs. And the from a devices perspective, we're at that tier of the 3GPP ecosystem, and there's a lot of unique things about Itron's business. One of them is we have very high density deployments. So it's not like a lot of other IoT applications where there might be millions of devices, but they're spread across the globe. A lot of times we're deploying 1 million devices in a city and, in a fairly confined geography. And so that leads, to the need for that secure, intelligent IoT connectivity, where we define that as the device choosing which RAN, which network, which MNO, could be public, could be private, the device should connect to. And managing that, for that customer in that country on that project, and then replicating that, thousands of times globally. Every country, that we do business in, which is over 100. So it's a little different than a lot of the typical IoT use cases. And so it's essential, that we build in the latest 3GPP technology, the integrated EUICC functionality where possible, and EUICC capability on all devices. And we produce a lot of battery-powered devices. And the other thing that's unique about what we do is provide those battery-powered devices with a battery life and a product life of up to 20 years. It varies a bit from country to country. Some countries it's a 10-year requirement, in others it's 15 years, but in several it's 20 years. It's not easy to get a 20-year product. Like a water meter or a gas meter or a sensor, and to last 20 years. So we, invest very heavily in that technology and deploying that. So that's kind of the transformation that we're seeing in our business that's driven by the emergence of, this secure, intelligent IoT connectivity.
Super. Thank you, John. That's great. And again, a lot of comments on Twitter about this at the moment as well, about also the role of IoT. And there might be a slight bias here because I talk about this subject a lot, but the role of IoT in other industry sectors as well. So around social impact. And Mark, with your organization as well, Mayflower is being mentioned at the moment as an example of that IoT connectivity. You mentioned about different geographies, John, kind of the most robust areas you could be in Mayflower project. I've seen that up in personal myself. So people are really reacting as well about how this is a multi-sector transformation opportunity, basically. So that's wonderful. So that's great. We've got lots of examples about that. And quick shout out to Myland at the moment as well. Answered an excellent question about specific challenges. I'm actually going to bring that into the section around challenges that will come next, Myland. So I'll bring you in on that one specifically. There's a brilliant question there. So just to give a shout out for that as well while we're talking about that. I think what we'll do is go into another question now as well and look at it from a different perspective. So we're talking about all these different range of IoT impacts. I'd like to bring in the people factor a little bit as well, specifically on workforces. How are you seeing IoT as an enabler there? And again, we're having questions on that as well. Mark, I know we touched on this before one-to-one. Can I bring you in on that one, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I'm fond of saying, IoT is a team sport. I've said it in the pre-call prep. And all of you listening can use it once without royalty. And after that, you must send me money. But what we're finding out is that certain industries are learning to specialize on what they do well. Like John's example, what Itron does really well is all the various meters and sensors. And then relying on what I'd call a situational team of experts to come together to help them solve their overall problem. Bringing in connectivity, bringing in integration, bringing in software from other places. So I think what you're finding is that early adopters and even the mainstream are discovering that let's stick to our own knitting. Let's not become IoT experts, but let's become experts at building that team, that situational team to solve the problem, whether it's in medical or industrial or connected car or any of the top verticals.
Fantastic. That's excellent. And another thing that's coming through from some questions is kind of this complementary partnership, I would describe it as. I think there's more of a actualization around that. I think the different working styles as well. We've seen the art of the possible. One note, again, looking at a particular question here about IoT and health specifically mental health, one thing I would point out is the combination between IoT and also AI around conversational AI bots for things like that as well, being that mediator between, like, for example, person talking to a line manager. We've seen some great new research there. So you're absolutely right. That was Jackie there on text, kind of talking about all these different new uses and kind of just bringing those to the fore as well. So I think we've got a great range around that. So thank you, Mark, and thank you for those questions as well. And Stefan, I would love to bring you in at the moment and talk a little bit more around this capacity for organisations to become more agile and resilient, probably the two biggest words over the last year, I would say. So how is IoT forming that role? How is it a catalyst for this agility or ambidexterity to change?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's quite clear, COVID was and is a black swan event that the majority of people simply didn't predict. So when we look at how enterprise attitudes, for example, to digital transformation were prior to the advent of COVID, I think the priority was not necessarily top of the list. I read an interesting survey recently by a company that found that following on from the pandemic, you suddenly have 97% of over 2,000 enterprises surveyed saying that actually this digital transformation is now top priority for them. And the real reason behind that is it's essentially about mitigating the risks. Because all of a sudden you had this situation where the workforce wasn't able to actually get into the office, into the factory, and so on. And all of a sudden you have everyone going, okay, well, what can we do about it? How can we streamline those business processes? How can we keep the machinery moving? And really, COVID, in that sense, has driven a tremendous increase in interest in how connected assets or connected workforces can really reduce that risk. I mean, certainly over the past year, we've seen a lot of interest on various industries. Healthcare is a great example for where it's not only about enabling the patients themselves to become connected, but there's a tremendous interest in deploying things like private networks in hospitals, because Wi-Fi might have been used in the past, but it's typically unreliable. But now you have the opportunity to perhaps use 5G to monitor where particular employees are, where particular medical devices are within the actual hospital or things like that. So yeah, it's driven a huge increase in demand.
Fantastic, thank you. And perhaps if we bring this section to a close, so to speak, let's look ahead at what comes next. So what business opportunities we're seeing, what business model evolution we're expecting, again, catalysed by IoT. Vincent, can I bring you back in first on that?
As far as the business possibilities and business models, I think what Nick was speaking to as well, taking out some of the layers of services that are between the end customer and the service providers or the telecoms even, and being able to create these new business models overall. I know we talked a little bit beforehand about types of business models that are enabled by kiosks, by vending machines, by things like lockers, and all these kinds of devices that are bypassing the traditional supply chains or business models of other companies. And we're seeing that as well. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges, which we'll get into, I think, next here. But the business possibilities is just expanding exponentially. And a lot of the aspects there, some of it, I think, have not even scratched the surface yet of what we can do with IoT technologies as we're moving outside of enterprise boundaries per se. So
I love that. I like to say use cases yet to be invented. So yeah, I think that's a great point. Absolutely. And maybe if I can get one final point on this before moving on. Stefan, perhaps I could bring you back in on this one as well, maybe to look at this from a service-based economy approach.
Yeah, I mean, my bias here is on the telco side, of course. I think when we look at the traditional business model of the telco industry, it's been about bytes and megabytes and rigid models surrounding that. I think we're going to move away more and more as time progresses to much more flexible models. I mean, when we look at what's happening in the IoT landscape itself, For example, there's millions and millions of sensor or telemetry-based devices that are being deployed in the field now. And those require new approaches to monetization. On the other hand, you have some IoT platform providers who are looking at outcome-based models rather than simple usage-based models. We're looking also, when you consider the emergence of iSIM, which is essentially an integrated eSIM, you're going to see more and more hardware players coming into the mix, and maybe they will want to get into the connectivity side as well and look to build out their expertise in hardware as well as services. So I think this really will mean that we're going to see a tremendous flourish in the flexibility of these business models surrounding IoT that will be based on, what are the customer requirements, what are the customer needs, things like that.
Absolutely, it's that word agility again, isn't it? I couldn't agree more. Fantastic. So I think what we'll do now, we've really set the stage, I think, and looked at all that transformation potential across so many different sectors. That's fantastic. We had a big reaction to that. So again, just giving this a nice real evidence base, let's also address the challenges along the way and how we can overcome those too. Because there have been some barriers that hold back that full kind of actualization opportunity around IoT, and negate the ability to really capitalize on it to its full potential. So what we'd like to look at now is kind of go round robin style, I think, on this one as well. Let's explore the different viewpoints around the table, looking at what those challenges are. And Stefan, I'd actually love to come back to you first as well, maybe talking about some of the wholesale commercials and other areas around this that are really important for IoT adoption with 5G.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when we look at the wholesale model, for example, for roaming, as I mentioned just now, it's typically or historically been based on bytes and megabytes, as well as the concept of a single provider or a single large operator who can give you a footprint that they might say is global, but not necessarily the case. What we're starting to see now is a development of that scenario, particularly driven by eSIM, that gives you the flexibility to switch between providers. But there are still challenges surrounding that ecosystem. There are some integrations to be done, for example. But the industry is working towards solving that. I mean, what we saw at MWC recently is that there are certainly developments in the standard to address those kind of requirements. On the module side, I think when we look at 5G, it's still pretty expensive. And when we look at private 5G in particular, what came out of MWC in particular was that perhaps some industries who have specific requirements are maybe waiting until we see the release 17 of the 5G standards, when you bring in things like what centimeter precision accuracy for location inside the factory, things like that.
Absolutely great points there. You're right, there was a great forum session on that MWC as well, and some related ones around spectrum that was particularly interesting on this end too. And again, I'm going to go to a couple of questions, so thank you so much for these. So I'll just do a little bit more on kind of the roundtable perspectives, and then I'm going to bring in two questions specifically that I think are really on point. Nick, can I go to you next, if that's okay, just to get your take here about what you see as the biggest challenges, and then obviously we're going to address how to overcome them.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Stefan said, and actually what John said. John said something I thought really profound, and it was in the middle of what he said, and he said it very quickly, and I just want to wind.
Absolutely.
John just used a phrase and said, "Let the device choose the connectivity," and then he just kept, and I just, that is very profound, because Stefan talked about, well, the industry has promised EUICC, a standard, and eSIM, which means an agnostic SIM. It's not locked. It can change. The problem is, though, that there's a danger that we all think, oh, well, eSIM and EUICC solves this, okay? But the problem is in a standard implementation of EUICC, the 820 MNOs that all today have their own proprietary SIM, and they choose the roaming agreements. They manage the connection. They choose the roaming agreements using a switch called the SMSR, Subscription Manager Service Routing, or routing even in the US. That's the switch. The switch is resident within the proprietary stacks. So although eSIM technically allows the SIM to become agnostic, the control of where it goes is still controlled by the same people who've controlled the market for 30 years, the MNOs. Now, our belief as SI, and of course it's our model, is that what you've really got to do is virtualize the switch, abstract it into the cloud, and make it agnostic. So then you can have a set of switching rules which are based on what John wants, which is let the meter choose the connection. Not any set of rules based on profitability of roaming agreements. And people don't realize that typical roaming agreements only remit 20% of the connectivity revenue to the person who receives the roaming, and the person who sends the invoice gets 100%. So as data prices decline, you're getting 20% of a smaller number. So the whole financial system and the economic model is actually encouraging proprietary behavior. And that's why you get people being kicked off on roaming. And so it sounds great that the standard's going to solve it. And then what happens is permanent roaming restrictions. You've met your quotas. Why do users have to worry about this? Now, from our perspective, what we do is our connections work like the Star Alliance, which is we do federated or distributed localization of the connection. So everyone's getting the full connection. And it works like the Star Alliance. You buy one ticket, you fly on any airline, even if they're competitors. But by abstracting that into the cloud and making it agnostic and having a Star Alliance, in effect, like Visa on top that collects the money, if you like, what you're getting is the best of all worlds, that you are then able to give the power to the enterprise to say, I want to choose the roaming agreements. And as John said, I actually don't even want to choose the roaming agreements. I want the device to pick whatever is, wherever I am, whatever's around me, public, private, whatever it is. I'm behind a tree, so I don't get Vodafone, but I do get whatever, EE in the UK, or not Verizon, but AT&T in the US. I want the device to make the choice, and I want it to be invisible to the enterprise. And that is actually enabled by eSIM and EUICC. But the ultimate success of technology is when it disappears. And that's when it becomes a mass adoption. And like Wi-Fi, I don't know whether there's Wi-Fi because it's invisible. And that's what we need to get to. And that's what John was saying is I want the device to choose the connectivity. And we must, as an industry, make sure we don't wave EUIC and eSIM as a magic wand and say, oh, I'm eSIM compatible, which everyone's doing on their website. You know, it's like, I'm 5G, I'm AI, and I'm eSIM compatible. And you've got to ask the next question, which is, do you manage the connection yourself, or do you give the management to the players? If they don't manage it, if they don't have an abstracted SMSR and their own billing engine, all they're doing is passing the connection between different proprietary stovepipes. So there's an industry we've got to solve that. And that's our model, but it has to be a generic model overall.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more there. And that the language around that and the awareness is a spot-on issue. We see it in other areas, don't we, about zero trust and misconception about what that means, for example, as a relatable one. Mark, I wonder if I could bring you back in on this as well. I know we spoke earlier about some of these barriers actually falling at the moment, and we're starting to move them out of the way, so to speak. Could I bring you in a little bit there just to talk a bit more about that for the audience?
Well, I think the barriers are falling because the costs are falling, first and foremost. I think one of the other wonderful analysts that we've all talked to in the past have predicted $1 a year or something like that for the cost of using a communication service. So cost barriers. The other barriers around, and Nick was just touching on this, availability of connectivity from a certain provider. Well, it's ubiquitous. I'm here in Boston. I've got 3 major providers. I do have choices around Wi-Fi. There's other alternative choices that have been looked at. The heliums, sort of these up and coming, interesting, crowdsourced networks. But at the end of the day, those barriers are dropping. But that also adds confusion for enterprises who don't want confusion. They want reliability. They want certainty. And they don't want to try. I mean, they'll try new things as a science project, but when it comes to running a service line or a product line, they don't want uncertainty. They don't want to play around because their customers are depending on them for whatever service that they are acquiring or whatever product that they're buying. But so I think those barriers are falling, and I think we're getting to the point where The latest generation of employees are coming in that are a little bit more communications savvy. This is the iPhone generation, and not necessarily, it doesn't follow that learning how to use an Android or an iPhone makes you a better IoT or M2M executive, if you will. But there are fewer barriers around understanding that cellular is an enabler. As Nick said, it's like the air that's out there now.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Vincent, I saw you reacting to that as well. Can I bring you on for that?
Certainly. Thank you. I'm going to maybe go on a little bit of a parallel track here, but kind of backtracking back to the data and the experience that these IoT devices, connectivity is obviously crucial and is the first step. The next part is looking at who is creating the data, who or what is creating the data, transmitting the data, processing it, or even taking action on the data that we have. And I think we're going to get into it a little bit further as well, but having an understanding of these IoT devices that are connecting to these infrastructures, understanding what is their supply chain, what is the hardware, what is the software that's on those devices, and what type of vulnerabilities and risks are they introducing, not only to the infrastructure, but to the business in general. So that, I think, is a crucial piece, as this perimeter of the network is once again changing for enterprises. We have this opportunity now to overcome some of the barriers that held us back when it comes to security, when it comes to secured communication, et cetera, et cetera. So I know we'll probably get into it a little bit further, but that was one of the points I wanted to bring up.
Hey, Sally, excuse me, can I jump in and just make a quick point, a shout out to Vincent's company, Armis. And forgive me if this was in the next section, but maybe people get to hear it. It's so good they get to hear it twice. But if you just think about the last conversation of the device chooses the connectivity, which I'm going to pinch that one, John. Public, private, I want any network that's available, and I want to public, private, and I want to seamlessly switch between them. And you think technically that sounds great, it's the holy grail. But what happens is when the device switches between the MNOs, its IP address changes. Right? People don't think about that. So one of the first things you have to do if you're going to secure the device is you have to find the device. But with eSIMs and EUICC, when a device switches, it doesn't leave a forwarding note. It doesn't say, my new address is. It just goes. One of the things that Armis does, because it's agentless security, is Armis does asset visibility first, then security second, and then they do anomaly detection behavior to see our device is behaving the right way. But with eSIMs, so long as you go via one platform with a network, MPLS, software-defined networking infrastructure, think of it like a ring road of a motorway, freeway for the US. It doesn't matter what junction you join or what junction you leave, the cars are all still on the same motorway. So in other words, if their IP address changes, I got on at junction 14, I'm now getting on at junction 12, they're in the same place, they're on the motorway. And that means that when the IP address changes, you don't lose the device. And just that one point is really important, because although eSIM has huge promise to introduce agnostic switching, let the device choose the connectivity, it also has a potential downside that you lose the devices. And one of the things Armis are doing is they can find the device and then they can secure them without having to put a piece of agent software on the device. And so it's these are the new types of leaders in this world where eSIM changes everything.
That's an excellent point. And it's already reacting to a few of the questions we've had around security as well. I flagged a couple on the screen there, but we're having a lot of comments on that. And it kind of leads me on to another question as well. So what you're seeing from an enterprise take in terms of some of the biggest challenges at the moment, and people are asking about security. So I know, Nick, you naturally was covering that anyway, but other things that are being mentioned are about visibility, reducing complexity, also having a few about tech integration, things like that as well. So would anybody like to come in on that particular question? I know, Vincent, we talked about maybe yourself from a comment earlier.
Yeah, as far as is kind of the primary concerns from an enterprise perspective, as this perimeter yet again changes and it goes into a network that is very unfamiliar to enterprise administrators, enterprise security teams, and really not understanding how do we manage and how do we provide security to these possibly hundreds of thousands of devices that are now joining the enterprise infrastructure. So number one, what we see on the enterprise side is a struggle with IoT devices joining corporate traditional networks and understanding what these are, what kinds of devices. These devices don't have agents many times. They don't have management systems, think of IP cameras or even, thermostats and lighting systems. Now, if we take that and extend it into a cellular infrastructure where the business is being driven by data coming in from quote unquote outside the enterprise, the challenge now becomes is what devices do I have? Where are they? What are they doing? Are they safe? Are they bringing in additional vulnerabilities or risks? What operating system? What is the supply chain of those devices? Many IoT devices are essentially Lego blocks. You pick some components off the shelf, you pick some operating systems, you pick some modules and software, but very often there's not a lot of a lot of consideration on what is the security of this device. Has it been vetted? What does this open source supply chain look like? So having, number one, that visibility into what devices are there, where are they, what are they doing, is crucial to then go on to looking at what are the vulnerabilities, what are the risks, what are the mitigating technologies or additional technologies that I need to have in order to secure those devices as they essentially join the enterprise, but from another infrastructure.
Excellent points there, Vincent. Thank you. Does anybody have any final thoughts on that? And then I'm going to move on to talk about more the enablement factors now, so overcoming some of those challenges.
I'll just jump in very quickly because I'm seeing some of the questions. And for those watching, understand that some of these questions flash up for a second or two and they go away. But there was a question that came up from a person whose family name was Win, asking about, is 5G overkill? And I've sort of seen some related questions. It's important to understand that 5G is an umbrella standard that's inclusive not only of this high bandwidth for massive numbers of devices, but also Wi-Fi is under the same umbrella as are a couple of variants of narrowband for agricultural or things that other applications where you don't require the full fire hose, you just want a little sip here and there. So I think some of the questions we're asking about that. So, and this is where it gets a little confusing with the phraseology around 5G. Again, it's an umbrella that has high speed, low speed, narrowband, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit for the viewing audience.
That's perfect, Mark. Thank you very much for coming in. I think really important. As part of the point of things like this is that awareness and clarifying where there's ambiguity. So I love that. So at that point, let's move on to look at IoT enablement. And we'll do this in two stages. Firstly, tech, and then some of the other equally important factors as well around people, culture, and skills. So first, I think it lends itself to talk about security again, because we're having a lot of questions around that. So how can embedding a security-first approach to IoT devices and infrastructure too, particularly from a design perspective up, be achieved? Vincent, can I bring into you on that? I know you've done a lot of work around IoT Safe, for example.
Yeah, definitely. So there are different aspects to what security. It starts with the device itself. Where is its source? What's the supply chain? And there's quite a few initiatives and companies and standards that are trying to address that. But it's still a challenge. Much of it, as I said, is Lego blocks and sometimes self-built. So number one, identifying those devices and understanding what kind of risks they have. The second part of it is also the infrastructure itself. As Nick mentioned, having an infrastructure that can aid the security tools and the security platforms that provide those essential mitigating security techniques, having them work hand in hand with each other is something to closely look at. What information can you get from the infrastructure? What can be fed into those platforms that provide security? This is actually something that in the past has not been done well, right? We went to Ethernet, we increased bandwidths, we put personal computers. So all those changes we've seen in the past, security was never really baked in. Here's our opportunity to not only bake in the security of the infrastructure itself, the pipes, the connectivity, but also bring in and bake in the security at higher levels overall. And I think as companies look at expanding or adopting these types of connectivities, going to private 4G, 5G networks, taking this opportunity to look at what is the overall security picture and approach, what are the platforms, the partners. I'm going to use up my one royalty of teamwork, right? Finding the right team of companies that can provide not just the connectivity, not just the management, but the overall picture that includes security and all the other aspects that need to be included.
Fantastic. And Stefan, obviously we're both at MWC. Could you just come in on that as well, particularly around IoT Safe?
Yeah, I mean, IoT Safe was a huge topic at MWC. Pretty much everyone I spoke to was talking about it. Essentially, what it is an applet that sits on the SIM or the eSIM, and you can, if you imagine an IoT deployment, in the first instance, they're not directly controlled by an individual human. They don't have any displays normally, so it's difficult to authenticate them on a connected cloud service, for example. So one of the key elements behind IoT Safe is using that to authenticate devices on cloud services. Now, what this does is use the SIM itself as a secure element to ensure the cryptographic functions, store the relevant keys, and so on, and really enable a secure chain of, I'm missing the word right now, basically a secure chain of communication between the device and cloud services. What we've also seen is that IoT Safe can be used for further applications that require that can be linked to security. For example, there was a demo of using IoT Safe for blockchain-enabled communications during MWC. So enterprises can use that and deploy those certificates at the production point in the factory, and then make sure that they have, here we go, secure chain of communication between the devices and cloud services.
Fantastic. I would also recommend PSA certified research around this particular subject as well, because I've got some questions about where you can go for further information, because again, cross-industry collaboration very much like this as well, that's looking at the device level. So just to give a shout out for that as well. Nick, I'd love to bring you in here as well to dive in. Again, we're getting some more questions around this role of device connectivity. So could I throw that to you, saying, how is this really this biggest lead for unlocking value and unlocking innovation, particularly around global IoT deployments?
Yeah, we've quoted a lot of data. So I'm going to do a mea culpa as one of the people who got it wrong. Okay, so what I mean by that was I was in Cisco for many years, more years than I care to remember, and Cisco famously, by the way, along with IBM, Mark, and Ericsson.
Sitting here quietly, Nick. I'm not bothering anybody.
We confidently predicted 50 billion things would be connected by 2020, never thinking that in 2022 we'd look back and get a scorecard. Turns out 11 billion, not 50 billion, got connected, and 8 billion of those PCs and tablets. So actually, we got 3 billion. That's pretty bad. In fact, that's a polite version. That's English understatement. If you actually double click on what actually happened, what happened was we had a lot of SMB, we had a lot of regional, and we had a lot of POCs. What we didn't have is the Pareto effect, which is with the 20% of the companies that own 80% of the things, they didn't do global deployments. It's almost a perfect mathematics. We were 20% of predictions, even include the tablets and whatever. And we missed 80%. Those 80% are the big companies. We haven't yet in IoT had big global deployments. Why? Security, by the way, is the number one reason, the last subject, because the threat perimeter is exploding. But the second reason is you cannot get ubiquitous connectivity. The device can't choose the connectivity, right? You just can't do it. And therefore, you have to put different SIMs in, and you have to manage different contracts and different APIs and different dashboards, different invoices. I mean, it's a series of proprietary stacks. And I've been in IT many, many years, and all technology starts off proprietary, and then a standard emerges and interoperability happens, and that's when you hit the inflection point. It hasn't yet happened in cellular connectivity. There's no other part of the whole IT industry where you have 820 proprietary players all shouting me, me, me. Okay, so The moment you unlock that and enable the device to choose the connectivity in an agnostic way, and and in a way where all the players can play, i.e., this Star Alliance idea, you then unlock the possibility of global connectivity. And that is the next big thing that's coming. And that is what's happening now, because if I can do a little shout out, we do 4 of the Fortune 10. So we do Amazon, we do Walmart, we do Shell, and we do BP. These are global projects where people are saying, I can now do global connectivity. You know, the Bosch lawnmower works in 120 countries. It's one SKU. And so that is what ubiquitous connectivity and effective security means. And I think that is the untapped potential of IoT, which is the big guys have not yet, in Geoffrey Moore parlance, crossed the chasm. But it's happening now. And eSIM and EUICC are technical enablers of global adoption. By the way, that's what John was talking about when he talks about Itron's strategy.
Absolutely. And maybe a quick follow-up, probably for both of you, actually, around the role of network orchestration around all of this as well. There's again some questions on that. I think it's a nice fit as a segue.
When you say both
Nick
of you,
and John, probably either of you would like to come in on that.
I'll just do a much shorter answer, and then I'll hand it to John, because he's actually doing it. You think about the whole point about eSIM, right? It's like the clock, right? The SIMs are bouncing between the numbers on the clock. So if you're going to implement what Vincent talked about, which is security and IoT safe, and Stefan, are you going to do it with a hub and spoke architecture? Because, you know, as any SIM can connect to any MNO, potentially you have a hub and 820 spokes. And I'm not including the private IoT providers, which is where people are buying the capacity to do. So what you now have, that's not going to work. You need a network extension. In effect, the IoT device has to have a quote IP address, or NAT, network address translation capability, which means it's as if it's connected to your corporate Ethernet. At which point you can do policy extension to the edge, like you're currently doing within your firewall, or to your hybrid cloud, the way IBM, with their Red Hat acquisition, are doing application management to the hybrid cloud edge. But what we really want to do is application management to the IT/OT edge, so for network function virtualization, network slicing, QoS. The only way you're going to do that is a network-enabled extension of policy. You can't do that with an 820-digit clock, by analogy. So the role of the network is fundamental to extending capabilities to the IT/OT edge.
Perfect. And John, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's interesting in the industry. All the emphasis, or much of the emphasis, is on the head-end systems and the back office platforms that are necessary to make all this work, and the network itself for the last decade or so has just been viewed as a dumb pipe. And I think that world is changing, and the network itself is no longer a dumb pipe. The interoperability and the evolution and adoption of standards to drive the inflection of growth, that's all part of the network, not just functioning as a dumb pipe. It's and I think it was Vincent that talked about Ethernet, and we kind of forgot about security. When Ethernet was created, there was certainly no inherent, network layer security, and the protocols that were layered on top of it, helped, and then that whole philosophy translated to the creation of the internet, which I'm aging myself a bit, but was very involved. I worked for a company at the time that built the first two internet exchange points, May East and May West here in the US. And, 20 years later, we look back and said, oh, we forgot about security. We built all that, and it was really cool. I watched the traffic growth through May East and May West for about 3 months, and watched it go from a few megabits per second to over 600 megabits per second. And we had evolved equipment platforms over that 3 months to using at the time very high-end DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, FDDI switches. And but security was not a part of that. It was all just about connectivity and the network behaving as a dumb pipe, and the network stepping up and behaving as a secure, intelligent transport platform is critical to the adoption and standardization of IoT. Everything Itron makes is multi-layer security based. We have very, very strong network layer security in all of our implementations. And we have very strong application layer security in all of our implementations. And we'll be taking full advantage of IoT Safe, for example, for that end-to-end application layer security. And then,
fantastic.
When we think about architecting our solutions, I'm always injecting, as we have our engineering meetings, and remind everyone that it's our responsibility to prevent Armageddon. And, when you're dealing with connecting millions of devices for a utility company, there's just no room for cutting any corners related to security. And
absolutely said. Thank you, John. That's fantastic. And I think we've got time for one final aspect on this section before we close around people, culture, and skills. So this is all about really drilling into, and we've covered some of this to a certain extent already, but really drilling into eSIM and device localization and how that is really at the hub of the wheel, so to speak, in transformation the connectivity value of the IoT value chain. Stefan, could I come to you on that first, if that's okay, perhaps around roaming in particular?
Yeah. I think this is really going to touch on some of the things that Nick was talking about earlier. I mean, when you look at historical cellular IoT, one of the reasons why it wasn't really a global endeavor is because you're either looking at a roaming contract with one or many providers who might not necessarily have the best coverage, or you're looking at several different domestic deployments, which means, in either case, you're dealing with several different contracts, several different KPIs, processes, and so on. Not to mention that in the factory, you're using color-coded SIM cards to put it in the right devices, and it's just a bit of a mess, really. So eSIM allows you, as Nick mentioned, to leverage that single SKU concept. Regulators around the world, MNOs around the world, are all looking at what roaming means for their networks, and some regulators, for example, Brazil is a classic example, has prohibited permanent roaming, so roaming of devices for more than 90 days. And some MNOs, for example, the US, Australia, are very concerned about inbound roaming connections and don't want those connections to be permanently roaming. So the eSIM de-risks that side of the market. It allows you, on the one hand, to download a local profile where you might want that performance or cost benefit, and it also allows you to comply with local regulations in terms of permanent roaming. So it's really going to, as the market around that develops, it's really going to simplify things. And one of the things that's happening right now in eSIM is GSMA is looking at the specification for eSIM and trying to understand and work on how to simplify that mechanism. I mean, Nick talked about the SMSR switch. that's the way SI have done it is not that common in the market, which means that when you move over to providers, you have a lot of difficulties in new integrations, changes in processes and things. It's very expensive. What we're looking towards is a simplification in that specification, and that's likely to come out around mid next year, I believe, that will allow an even easier facilitation for eSIM deployments globally.
Fantastic. And Nick, I think there was a great segue for you to come in on that as well.
Oops, I was on mute, sorry. Look, we've made huge progress as an industry, but as Stefan's said, it's still not a badge of honor, is it, to look back and say, well, even once you've chosen your connectivity partners, a regulator somewhere can make a decision and you're off. Or a quota can be exceeded and suddenly you're off. I mean, if 820 people each have a roaming agreement with everybody else, I don't know what that is. Is that 819 factorial? Someone clever than me will work that out. But it's like a house of cards, right? And they've all got quotas where you can have 10,000 devices and you can have 20,000 and you can have, and then the moment a number gets exceeded, you're off. And we've had devices, medical devices, that were turned off with 4 hours notice. I mean, if you're doing heart monitoring, you can't build that. So there has to be a different way. And part of the reason is the data costs are declining, and roaming only pays 20% to the receiver of the roaming. So mathematically, it's 100% certain that this model is never going to work, because it's getting worse every day. $1 per IoT per year. What's that? 8 cents a month. You're getting 20%. You're getting 1.6 cents if on your 20%. It's just not worth it, right? Because your Cisco routers and switches aren't following the same curve down. So the model's going to collapse. So you have to abstract it. You have to be agnostic, and you have to do federated localization, not, I do global roaming. There's loads of people say, I do global roaming. All you're doing is giving the connection to people where they manage it and they can turn it off. So Stefan used the phrase, the way we've done it is not usual, because we built it, our founders created Zigbee, and so said, how do you do ubiquitous, always on 100% global connectivity? I mean, that's basically what we do. And if you have to do 100% always on ubiquitous global connectivity, you can only do it with a Star Alliance type model, where you are avoiding all these roaming problems. So it is a huge issue for IoT, roaming. And Stefan, Kaleido Intelligence are the world experts in roaming, that they're set up specifically, just a shout out for you, Stefan, for people watching. Kaleido came out of Juniper Research, they specifically to be an analyst house on roaming. So I would really point people towards their research, because there's fantastic a lot of people don't know the sort of things we've described on this, and a great place to educate yourself is to start off at Kaleido's website.
Fantastic. Great shout out. I love that. The education piece is so important around this. And we're starting to run short on time. So Mark, I know you wanted to come in on a quick comment. If we could make it a quick one just to round that off, and then we're just going to focus a little bit more on culture, education, skills.
Sure, quickly. A little while back, Nick talked about these massive numbers that were predicted 15 or 20 years ago, and I'm unaware of the provenance of all those numbers, so I won't take any blame or culpability on it. But I look at certain. First of all, IoT's been around 12 to 15 vertical segments. The largest is connected car. GSMA, our friends at GSMA have predicted roughly 500 and some odd million connected cars to be fully available, or over 500 million connected cars in the next 3 years, I believe was the number. It's cars, it's things, it's assets, it's medical devices, it's industrial things, it's meters, it's things of that nature. So I would kind of say, while the glass might be half full in some regards, IoT has really been solving a lot of key critical problems for a number of industries. Again, thanks to this team sport mentality, those that have done that have succeeded. That's the end of my comment.
Love that. That's brilliant. We've got some phrases that are going to last from this conversation already, haven't we? Absolutely. So at this point, let's go into the kind of wrap-up piece, really. And again, I love to shine a light on this because technology, obviously, hugely significant, but it's all that underpins that as well, isn't it? It's around the culture, it's around process, it's around skills uplift in areas like this as well. And I know the audience has got a big interest in this. I'm seeing some comments on it already. And first, Mark, I'm going to go back to you on this one, if that's okay.
Sure.
But we're talking about Industry 5 more and more at the moment. And as part of that, very much around augmentation, around IoT, and also human decision making. So how is that combination kind of better enabling the realization of the promise, really, of Industry 5?
Factories are now embracing 5G networks. It gives them greater flexibility to reconfigure a manufacturing line. We were talking about supply chain earlier, and giving factories and industrial providers the ability to very quickly change based on the market is very, very important. This notion of private 5G networks or private networks is really coming to the fore as well.
Fantastic. And people are asking for some tangibles in terms of advice. It's kind of that human people partnership I mentioned earlier on. So how can organizations best deliver on this optimal combination, if you will, with IoT and people coming together to deliver innovation at scale? Mark, I'll come back to you first, because there's a nice kind of fit to what you've already said already, and then I'll open it up to the panel for any future thoughts on that.
So I think skilling up the new generation in industry is very important. They're already network savvy. They've already been on video calls and FaceTime calls. So none of this stuff is really new, but skilling them up, yet maintaining this linkage to kind of the old timers that can listen to a machine and understand that, oh, that one's not working out quite well because the sound is wrong. So it's this kind of transition from the veteran, the old grizzled veterans, to the newer tech savvy players. I think that's going to make a difference. And I'm not looking at you, Nick. And John, I won't even touch it with you. And we're all about the same age, by the way.
Oh, brilliant stuff. And Nick, on that subject as well, I want to, because people are asking questions about some of the research that was mentioned around this event. Can I go to you as well? Because I want to make sure we get this in around the future of IoT shout out, because it's a great fit of kind of looking ahead and what's next.
Our whole philosophy is actually to lead with education, because most people are really confused. If you had to have one word, IoT, what's the word that springs to mind? It's complex. I mean, it's just complex. We talked about it a lot. So we decided to pivot all of our messaging around initially just education and awareness and guidance. And so there's multiple bits of collateral on our website. One of the ones is called the Future of IoT Report, where we interviewed industry leaders and asked their views on the future of IoT. And it's a series of thought pieces from some pretty heavy hitters. And maybe even some people on this podcast, who knows? But their view on what's going to happen next and what the really big trends are. And so the best thing I can do is just, there's a bunch of other stuff, but that's a really good source. We also do a series of podcasts, IoT leaders. By the way, in case you're tempted to listen to Mark Thurman's podcast, these are much better, Sally. I just want to make that point. But yeah, the IoT leaders, future of IoT is a good source of information.
Fantastic. And what we'll do as well, we'll put links out around that, and also my newsletter as well, but also to your podcast, Mark, your podcast, my one, Tomorrow's Tech Today as well. So there'll be lots of education resources for everybody, which is brilliant. So and on that question, can I throw it out to you all as well around the importance of collaboration? So we've touched on this a few times. Again, we're getting a lot of comments on it. And again, quite a few people who were always at MWC were saying kind of one of the key top trends, probably in the top 3, was that power of the ecosystem. So what's your advice or perspectives there around how we can better enhance that between enterprise and IoT partners? Has anybody got any specific thoughts on that one?
I'll go very quickly, and I won't respond to Nick's slight on my podcasts, which are fantastic, by the way. I have 75 of them. Anyway, pick the right partners. It's situational. So make sure the partner can solve the problem you're choosing them for. Don't pick a medical integrator if you're setting up smart meters. So pick the right partner and understand that everything is getting connected, will be connected, and understand what to do with the data, where to store the data, how to deal with security, but pick the right partners.
Brilliant advice, fantastic. And again, supporting all of this is this power of education. What can we do better to kind of improve IoT education across a diversity of roles in the organisation? I think that's hugely important as well. Vincent, I'd love to bring you in on that particular question.
Certainly. So number one is, IoT has been here already in the enterprise and Wi-Fi, especially for a long time, and has worked its way in. And I think part of the education to begin with is, where are you now already? What IoT is already present within your environment? How is it currently driving your business? I think a big other part of the education comes with especially understanding connectivity, understanding that IoT, especially in the cellular world, is not going to be that much different than it is currently inside your enterprises. When it comes to understanding security policies and standards that you want to enforce, when it comes to the platforms and tools that you currently use within the enterprise, needs to have the same or equivalent. So with global connectivity, you also need global visibility, right? That's kind of what Armis's wheelhouse is. And so again, choosing your team, and I'll pay you the royalties, Mark, on the second mention of that one. Choosing your team and having the right partnerships. This is why Armis has partnered with SI, has partnered with IBM, is to help really bring the knowledge and intelligence to the customers and the enterprise leaders. So education as far as understanding which partners to engage with, educations into what are not just the benefits to my business, but what are also the risks that these new devices are bringing to the business, I think are key elements of what needs to be happening.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more strongly on that. It's fantastic. And I've been going through questions very naturally as we've gone along, because the questions coming through have really lent themselves to that. So for a final close one, and at least 6 people have answered the same thing, kind of like a horizon scan. If we were to come back to this conversation, the average length has been 5 years, but if you want to bring it forward to that, I totally understand. But kind of where would you see the biggest change in the ecosystem at that point? It could be from, I'm having different questions here about use cases, new business models, just the state of the tech advancement. If anybody's got a perspective on that, I think that might be a great place to kind of end it with that horizon scan for the future. Nick, over to you.
I'm actually going to address this from a completely non-tech perspective. All right.
Perfect.
So I am going to go back to, this feels like 1997, right? And what I mean by that is, we were talking about the internet and websites and HTML and meta tagging, and it was all about the tech, and it was all about making it easy. And then 10 years later, we didn't really talk about that. What we said is, wow, Amazon, wow, Uber, wow, now we say Netflix. All these companies didn't exist, and they disrupted established companies who didn't move quick enough. And so what I would say is, 5 years from now, and I think it's happening now, is that, we're talking a lot about the tech just because it's so complicated, but we're going to solve those, as this podcast has covered very, very well. But what's going to happen is that disruption is going to happen all over again. And those, we don't know who the next Netflix, Amazons, Ubers, pick your disruptors. But it will happen, because back to the very first comment, what IoT does is it disrupts business models. And so our call to action is that, just do something, because standing still is historically proven to be extremely dangerous. Your business model will get disrupted. It will get disrupted by someone who hasn't got a brand, and maybe even is only just 2 people in a garage right now. But it will get disrupted. History has proven over and over again that the next leaders by every industry sector will probably be companies that didn't exist 3 years ago. The moment you enable global, ubiquitous, secure capability, whereas John said, where the products choose the connectivity, so we stop talking about it and it just works, then business disruption goes on steroids. And so 5 years from now, there will be very different companies being invited to these podcasts.
Exactly, well said. And also other catalysts of business model evolution as well, thinking sustainability and energy consumption and the impact in that area. We've touched on that a couple of times as well. And again, I see that as another one that's going to be really kind of centre stage in many ways if it's not already. I'd love to go around the rest of the group as kind of a final point, either on that specific horizon question or kind of your personal key takeaway to share before we bring things to a close. Maybe Vincent first.
Certainly. So one of the things, kind of as mentioned before, what is IoT bringing to the business, and kind of dovetailing to what Nick was saying, the disruptors. If you look at the technologies and how IoT plays a part in the business of the disruptors, I think you're going to see an increase of that. Just like the red boxes of the world took over, the blockbusters of the world. It's these IoT type devices, these in some cases unmanaged or self-sufficient devices that are taking over. A big shift in how enterprises utilize these private 4G, 5G networks as part of their enterprise networks. We talked a little bit before about IT, OT convergence, where these previously disparate networks, the IT side wants more visibility into OT. They want to understand, what are these devices doing? What kind of maintenance do they need? What kind of preventative care? The same thing is, I believe, going to happen to these IoT devices, cellular connected or even internally connected, where you need that same visibility, you need that same insight into what's happening, except the scale changes tremendously. You're going from managing maybe several thousands or tens of thousands of devices into hundreds to millions of devices, and you need to be prepared and have the platform to do so. So I'm not sure if that's 5 years down the road, but then being able to understand the relationship of all the assets that you have to your business and your business model is going to be key, because any kind of impact into those assets is going to impact your business as well.
Perfect, thank you. And maybe Stefan, over to you. Thank you.
Well, as a research house, our core business is numbers, so I'm going to go with that side of things. I mean, when we look at the eSIM ecosystem in particular, I mean, when we look back to 2020, number of connected eSIM devices was, for IoT at least, was under 100 million. So that is going to increase by an enormous amount. By 2025, we're going to be looking at over 1 billion connected eSIM devices, and that's really been driven by the things that we've been discussing today to simplify that the way that devices can be deployed and connected on a global scale, and ensuring that that flexibility as well. It's important to mention as well, eSIM moving forward, when we look towards private LTE, private 5G, is likely to become a key enabler of that sort of authentication mechanism when perhaps you want devices to move between the public network and private network. Private networks themselves, when we look towards 2026, we're going to be seeing over 22,000 enterprise deployed private networks. So an enormous growth from what we saw last year, where it's really just a handful.
Powerful numbers there. Absolutely. That's brilliant, Stefan. Thank you so much. And I think if we just take a minute each just to finish off, that would be wonderful. And John, if I could go to you next. Thank you very much.
Well, my big takeaways from today are the reinforcement of what how I view this market. One, it's very complex. Two, it's you can't do it by yourself. You've got to have a set of partners that you trust. The teamwork, the team sport that Mark talks about, the education, and then once you've invested enough time in learning what the problem is and how complex it is, and you understand where your gaps are in your own business model and your own business plan, and then developing the right strategy to get to where you want to be when you need to be there. And then I appreciate, Nick, you're referring to it as a profound comment, but just it simply boils down to the device choosing which RAN it connects to, and like Nick said, it just works. So getting all those pieces lined up, understanding that, not arm waving, not pretending you understand how this all works, but having the right set of partners to, help you really deeply understand that, bring that depth of experience to the table, so you understand what you're really getting into.
Fantastic, John. Thank you. And final word over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Final word, 5 years. I believe more things connected intelligently and securely. And this notion of taking each silo, because most of these large deployments are siloed. Medical devices are not talking to connected cars, but probably the emergence of a secure, GDPR compliant way to get meaningful information amongst and between the silos. I think that's something we'll see in the next 5 years. So to Nick's point, that might be a new company. It might be the new Netflix or the new Blockbuster or whatever other analogy. And I just want to thank everybody for their great questions. And Sally, thank you for your fantastic moderation.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you all as well. And I know we're out of time, but we were having so many questions and everybody agreed to carry on, which is fantastic. I appreciate that. So what we'll do as well, again, still more questions to answer. We'll come back to those as much as we can after the event as well. Again, we've mentioned quite a few research reports, particularly the Future of IoT one, different podcasts, all sorts of different educational resources here. So we'll make sure we share all of those as well so we can continue the conversation. I think it leaves me to say thank you so much to Nick, Stefan, Vincent, Mark and John. Honestly, it's been great joining you today. And so thank you for all your time and thank you all for watching and for your great questions too. We really appreciate all your interaction.